rope was already around her wrists before Elena Voss understood what was happening. She had gone to bed in her own room, in her own home, believing she was safe. Now she stood barefoot on cold dirt at the edge of the training yard, the night air biting through her thin dress, while two men she had never seen before tightened knots around her hands. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack. "Let go of me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. It came out shaking anyway. Neither man answered. One of them, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar running down his jaw, simply looked at her the way a merchant looks at a sack of grain. Something to be weighed, priced, and handed over. Elena twisted her wrists, testing the rope, but it only tightened. Panic rose in her throat, like water filling a glass too fast. She looked past the men, toward the house she had lived in her whole life, hoping to see a light turn on, a door open, someone coming to stop this. No one came. That was the moment the truth landed on her like a physical blow. This was not an attack from outsiders. This was arranged. Someone inside her own home had allowed strangers to walk into the yard in the middle of the night and take her. "Where is my father?" she asked, forcing the words out. "Where is Gareth Voss?" The scarred man finally spoke. "Sleeping, most likely. Men who sell their daughters usually sleep well afterward, less to feel guilty about once the deal is done." The words hit her harder than a slap. Sold. Her own father had sold her. Elena's mind raced backward, searching for warning signs she might have missed. The whispered conversations that stopped the moment she entered a room. The strange visitors who came late at night and left before sunrise. Her father's refusal to meet her eyes at dinner the past few days. She had noticed all of it and told herself it was nothing. Pack business, debts, politics. She had never imagined it meant this. She thought of her mother, gone 3 winters now, and was almost glad she wasn't alive to see this moment. Marlene Voss would never have allowed her only daughter to be treated like a bargaining chip. But Marlene was gone, and Gareth Voss, weak and desperate to save what remained of his crumbling pack, had apparently decided his daughter's life was worth less than his own survival. "Move," the scarred man said, giving her a rough push forward. Elena stumbled but kept her footing. She refused to fall in front of these men. Whatever was happening to her, whatever came next, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. They led her through the trees behind her family's land, deeper into territory she didn't recognize. The moon was thin that night, barely enough light to see the path, but the men moved with certainty, as if they had walked this route many times before. Elena counted her steps at first, an old habit to calm her nerves, but she lost count somewhere past 200, and stopped trying. She thought about running. Wolves could sense fear, sense intention, and she was certain these men would catch her within seconds, even if her hands were free. But some instinct, deep inside her, refused to simply walk quietly into whatever fate awaited her. "Where are you taking me?" she asked again. This time it was a different man who answered, younger, with a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with what they were doing. "To Draven," he said quietly. "He's waiting." "Who is Draven?" The younger man glanced at his companion before answering, as if seeking permission. "You'll see soon enough." Elena filed the name away. Draven. If she survived whatever came next, she intended to remember every detail, every name, every face. Someone had made a decision to throw her life away for their own gain, and she refused to disappear quietly enough that no one would ever be held accountable. They walked for what felt like an hour before the trees began to thin, and a small clearing opened ahead. A fire burned low in the center, and around it stood perhaps a dozen figures, all watching her approach with the same hungry, appraising look the scarred man had given her earlier. At the head of the group stood a tall man, with dark hair and cold eyes. He didn't move as she was brought forward, simply watched, arms crossed, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Elena understood immediately that this was Draven. "So," he said, his voice smooth in a way that made her skin crawl, "this is what a beta's daughter looks like when her father runs out of options." "I don't know what my father promised you," Elena said, lifting her chin despite the fear coursing through her. "But whatever it wasn't mine to give." Draven laughed, a short, humorless sound. Brave words for someone standing where you're standing. He circled her slowly, studying her the way one might study a horse before a race. "Your father owed a debt, a large one. Debts have to be paid somehow, and since his pack has nothing left worth taking, he offered something else instead. Me." "You," Draven agreed, "though not quite in the way you might think. You're not payment, little wolf, you're bait." The word landed strangely in her ears. Bait, not a trade, not a hostage to be ransomed, but something meant to lure someone else into a trap. A cold understanding began to form in her mind, and it terrified her more than anything that had happened so far that night. Bait for what? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Draven's smile widened. Not what, who. He leaned closer, and she forced herself not to step back. There is a king not far from here. A young one, still building his strength, still proving himself to the packs under his protection. Kings like that cannot ignore a scent of distress carried on the wind, especially not one as unusual as yours. Elena didn't understand what he meant by unusual, but she didn't have the chance to ask. Draven straightened and gestured to two of his men. Tie her at the clearing's edge. Make sure her scent carries far, and someone light a second fire, further out. We want this seen from a distance before it's smelled up close. The men obeyed immediately, dragging Elena toward a wooden post half buried in the earth at the far side of the clearing. She fought against them out of instinct, twisting and pulling, though she knew it changed nothing. They bound her to the post, rope biting into her already raw wrists, and stepped back to admire their work like craftsmen finishing a project. You won't get away with this, Elena said, hating how small her voice sounded against the vast dark forest around her. Draven crouched in front of her, studying her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. Curiosity, perhaps, or calculation. You misunderstand your situation, he said. This isn't about getting away with anything. This is a trap, and traps only work when the prey walks in willingly. Your king will come because something in him won't be able to resist it, and when he does, we'll be ready. He's not my king, Elena said. I don't even know his name. Ronan Ashford, Draven said simply, standing back up. Though it won't matter to you either way. Once this is over, whether he lives or dies, your part in this story ends the same way. Used, then discarded. He turned and walked back toward the fire, leaving her alone at the edge of the clearing with the cold night pressing in around her. The men who remained kept their distance, watching, waiting, occasionally exchanging quiet words she couldn't hear. Elena tested the ropes again, feeling for any weakness, any give. There was none. Whoever had tied these knots knew exactly what they were doing. She thought about her father, sitting safely at home while she stood tied to a post in the middle of the woods, sacrificed to settle a debt he had created. She thought about the years she had spent trying to earn his approval, trying to be useful to a pack that had never truly valued her. All of it had led here, to this post, to this fire, to this waiting. But somewhere beneath the fear, a small stubborn part of her refused to accept that this was simply how her story would end. She didn't know who Ronan Ashford was, didn't know if he would come at all, didn't know what would happen if he did. But she knew she wasn't finished fighting yet, not while she still had breath left to fight with. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the fire, the damp earth, and beneath it, something else entirely. Elena couldn't place it, but she noticed the men around the clearing suddenly grow tense, their eyes turning toward the darkness beyond the trees. Something was coming. Draven straightened by the fire, his expression sharpening into something eager and dangerous. There, he murmured, almost to himself. Right on time. Elena's pulse quickened. Whatever was approaching through those trees, whether salvation or simply a new kind of danger, was about to change everything. She pulled against the ropes one final time, not because she believed she could free herself, but because some part of her needed to face whatever came next, on her own terms, fighting until the very last moment. The fire crackled. The forest went unnaturally quiet, and somewhere beyond the tree line, something powerful was drawing closer with every passing second. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness, and every rogue in the clearing turned toward the sound at once. Elena strained against the post, trying to see past the flickering firelight into the black tree line beyond. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain the men around her could hear it. Whatever was coming, it moved with a silence that unsettled even Draven's most seasoned fighters. She watched two of them exchange a glance, their hands drifting toward the knives at their belts. Positions, Draven said quietly, and the rogues scattered into the trees surrounding the clearing, vanishing into shadow with practiced ease. Only Draven remained near the fire, arms crossed, watching the darkness with the calm confidence of a man who believed every outcome had already been decided in his favor. Elena wanted to call out, to warn whoever was approaching that this was a trap, that stepping into this clearing meant stepping into an ambush designed specifically to destroy them. But her voice caught in her throat, and before she could force the words free, a figure stepped out from between the trees. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once needed to rush. Even from a distance, Elena could feel something radiating from him, a quiet authority that seemed to press against the air itself. His eyes swept the clearing once, taking in the fire, the post, her, and then the empty spaces where he clearly sensed hidden bodies waiting. He knew. He knew it was a trap, and he had come anyway. "Ronan Ashford," Draven said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing, warm with false hospitality. "I wasn't certain you'd come yourself. I expected you'd send scouts first." Ronan didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved to Elena, tied at the post, and something shifted in his expression, quick and sharp, gone before she could fully understand what she had seen. "You went through a great deal of trouble," Ronan finally said, his voice low and even, "to get my attention." "Not trouble at all," Draven replied. "More like an investment. I imagine most kings would have sent someone else to check on a distress signal this far from their own lands. Yet here you are." "There's a difference between sending someone else and abandoning someone who needs help," Ronan said. Draven's smile thinned slightly. "How noble. Unfortunately for you, nobility tends to get people killed." Elena watched the exchange with growing dread, aware that every word spoken was simply buying time, positioning, a prelude to whatever violence Draven had planned. She pulled at the ropes again, desperate to do something, anything, other than stand helplessly at the center of this confrontation. "Let her go," Ronan said. "Whatever quarrel you have, it isn't with her." "On the contrary," Draven said. "She's the only reason you're standing here at all. Without her, you'd still be safely behind your borders, and I'd still be waiting for an opportunity that might never have come." He gestured toward Elena almost lazily. "She's served her purpose already." Ronan's jaw tightened, and for the first time Elena saw something beneath his calm exterior, a controlled anger that ran deep. "Then let her go, and we can settle whatever this is between the two of us." Draven laughed, shaking his head as though genuinely amused. "You misunderstand the arrangement, Your Majesty. This was never meant to be a fair fight. It was never meant to be a fight you could win at all." At his signal, the surrounding trees erupted with movement. Rogues emerged from every direction, closing in around Ronan in a tightening circle. Elena counted at least 10, maybe more, each one positioned to cut off any possible retreat. Ronan didn't flinch. If anything, his posture settled into something calmer, more focused, as though the odds against him only sharpened his concentration rather than shaking it. "You should have brought more men," Draven said. "I didn't come here to fight all of you," Ronan replied. "I came here to end this before it started." The first attack came fast, a rogue lunging from the left, and Ronan moved to meet it with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size. Elena watched, breath caught in her throat, as the clearing dissolved into motion, bodies clashing and separating in the flickering firelight. She had never witnessed anything like it, the sheer controlled power radiating from Ronan as he handled attacker after attacker, never wasting movement, never losing his composure even as the numbers against him seemed impossible. Still, she could see it wasn't easy. Even someone as strong as Ronan Ashford could only hold off so many opponents for so long, and more rogues kept emerging from the trees, replacing those who fell back, wearing him down through sheer volume rather than skill. Elena's mind raced. She couldn't fight, couldn't run, but she refused to simply watch someone risk everything to help her without trying something herself. Her eyes fell on a loose stone near the base of the post, half buried in the dirt. If she could reach it, if she could use it against the rope somehow, perhaps she could free herself and create even the smallest distraction. She twisted her body, straining against her bindings, ignoring the way the rope tore at her skin, until her fingers brushed the edge of the stone. It wasn't much, but it was sharp along one side, and she began working it against the rope with desperate, careful movements, aware that any sudden motion might snap the fragile progress she was making. Across the clearing, Draven watched the fight with growing frustration as Ronan continued to hold his ground far longer than anticipated. "Enough," he finally snapped, stepping forward himself, drawing a blade from his side. "If you want something done properly, you handle it yourself." Elena's stomach dropped. Draven moved with a different kind of danger than his men, more controlled, more precise, and she understood immediately that this was the true threat, the reason the ambush had been planned so carefully in the first place. Ronan turned to face him, breathing hard but steady, blood visible along one arm from an earlier exchange. Their eyes met across the firelight, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "You should have stayed home," Draven said. "You should have chosen a different plan," Ronan replied. They came together with a speed that made Elena's breath catch, blades and bodies moving in a blur she could barely follow. She kept working at the rope, faster now, ignoring the sharp pain in her wrists, focused entirely on freeing herself before it was too late to matter. The rope gave way suddenly, unraveling just enough for her to pull one hand free. Relief flooded through her, quickly replaced by uncertainty about what to do next. She was free, but unarmed. standing at the edge of a fight far beyond her ability to influence directly. Then she saw it, one of Draven's men, positioned at the tree line, raising a bow, aiming not at Ronan directly in the chaos of combat, but at an angle meant to strike him from a blind side while his attention remained fixed on Draven. Without thinking, without weighing the danger to herself, Elena grabbed the loose stone and threw it as hard as she could toward the archer, shouting a warning at the same time. The stone struck his shoulder, throwing off his aim just enough that the arrow went wide, missing Ronan by inches instead of finding its mark. Ronan's eyes flicked toward her for the briefest moment, something unreadable passing across his face, before he turned his focus back to Draven with renewed intensity. Whatever had shifted in that instant, whatever recognition had passed between them, it seemed to fuel something in him, a determination that hadn't been there before. The fight continued, but something had changed. Ronan pressed forward with new purpose, driving Draven back step by step, until finally, with a final decisive movement, he disarmed him completely, sending the blade skittering across the dirt. Silence fell over the clearing. The remaining rogues, seeing their leader defeated, hesitated, uncertain whether to continue or retreat. "This ends now," Ronan said, his voice carrying clearly despite his exhaustion. "Anyone who wants to walk away still has that choice. Anyone who doesn't will regret it." One by one, the rogues melted back into the trees, abandoning Draven where he knelt in the dirt. Draven himself looked up at Ronan with an expression somewhere between fury and grudging respect. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "Maybe not," Ronan replied, "but tonight, it is." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned and crossed the clearing toward Elena, who stood frozen at the edge of the firelight, one hand still free, the other hanging limply where the rope remained tied. As he approached, she saw the full extent of what the fight had cost him, cuts and bruises visible beneath torn clothing, exhaustion evident in every step. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer than she expected. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly. "You're the one who's bleeding." A faint, tired smile crossed his face as he reached her side and began working at the remaining rope with careful hands. "I've had worse." Elena watched him work, still trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single night. Sold by her own father, bound as bait, witness to a fight that could easily have ended in someone's death, and now standing free beside a stranger who had risked everything to save her, without knowing anything about her at all. "Why did you come?" she asked quietly, as the last of the rope fell away. Ronan straightened, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the fighting had ended. Something passed between them again, the same unreadable spark from before, quiet but undeniable. "Something told me I had to," he said simply. "I'm still trying to understand exactly why." Behind them, the fire continued to burn low, and somewhere in the darkness, Draven's remaining loyal men watched from a distance, already beginning to plan their next move. But for now, in this moment, Elena Voss stood free for the first time since she had been dragged from her home, and beside her stood the man who had refused to let her fate be decided by anyone else's greed. A twig snapped somewhere behind the tree line, and Ronan's head turned instantly toward the sound, his body tensing back into alertness despite the exhaustion still written across his face. "We need to move," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Draven's men won't stay scattered for long. Once they regroup and realize how few of us are actually here, they'll come back." Elena rubbed at her raw wrists, wincing as feeling returned to her fingers. "Move where? I don't even know where we are." "Away from here first," Ronan said. "We can figure out the rest once there's distance between us and this clearing." He extended a hand toward her, an offer rather than a command, and Elena hesitated only a moment before taking it. His grip was firm but careful, as though he were conscious of how fragile her trust in him still was, despite everything he had just done to earn it. They moved quickly through the trees, Ronan leading with the confidence of someone who could navigate unfamiliar terrain by instinct alone. Elena struggled to keep pace at first, her legs unsteady from hours of standing bound at the post, but she pushed through the discomfort, refusing to be the reason they were caught. "Where are your men?" she asked eventually, once they had put enough distance between themselves and the clearing that speaking felt safer. "I came with a small guard," Ronan admitted. "They're stationed further back, watching the wider perimeter. I didn't want a large group announcing our approach before we understood what we were walking into." "That was reckless," Elena said, surprising herself with how sharp her tone came out. Ronan glanced at her sideways, something like amusement flickering across his tired features. "Perhaps, but reckless got you free." She had no response to that, so she said nothing, focusing instead on placing one foot in front of the other as they continued deeper into the trees. The forest around them felt endless in the darkness, every shadow suddenly suspicious, every sound making her flinch. "You're afraid," Ronan observed quietly, not unkindly. "Wouldn't you be?" Elena replied. "Hours ago I was asleep in my own home. Now I'm walking through unfamiliar woods with a man I've never met, running from people who wanted to use me as a trap to kill him." "Fair point," Ronan admitted. "Though for what it's worth, you're handling it better than most would." Elena wasn't sure that was true, but she appreciated the attempt at reassurance nonetheless. They walked in silence for a while longer, until the trees began to thin, and the sound of quiet voices reached them from ahead. Ronan's posture relaxed slightly. "My guard," he said. "We're close." Moments later, they emerged into a small clearing where several figures waited beside horses, clearly on edge from the extended absence of their king. A tall man with graying hair at his temples stepped forward immediately, relief evident on his face. "You're alive," he said. Then his eyes shifted to Elena, taking in her disheveled state, the rope marks still visible on her wrists. "And you brought company." "Callum, this is Elena," Ronan said. "She's coming with us." Callum's eyebrows rose slightly, though he said nothing more than a respectful nod in her direction. "The horses are ready. We should leave before first light, in case anyone decides to follow." Ronan helped Elena onto one of the horses before mounting his own, and within minutes they were moving through the forest at a steady pace, putting further distance between themselves and the clearing where everything had nearly gone wrong. Elena held onto the reins tightly, her mind still spinning from the events of the night. She stole occasional glances toward Ronan, riding just ahead of her, and found herself thinking about the strange charge that had passed between them in the clearing, the way his eyes had found hers in the middle of chaos, and seemed to recognize something she didn't understand herself. She told herself it was simply relief, the natural connection formed between someone rescued and their rescuer, but some quiet part of her suspected it was something more, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. They rode through the remainder of the night and into the early hours of morning, until the trees finally opened onto a wide road leading toward distant walls she could just make out against the lightening sky. Ronan slowed his horse to ride alongside hers. "That's my kingdom," he said, nodding toward the walls in the distance. "You'll be safe there." "Safe," Elena repeated, testing the word. It felt unfamiliar after everything that had happened. "For how long?" "For as long as you want to be," Ronan said. Something in his tone made her look at him more closely, searching his expression for whatever lay beneath the simple statement. He met her gaze steadily, and she felt that same strange pull again, stronger this time, impossible to dismiss as simple imagination. "What happened back there?" she said carefully, "in the clearing, when our eyes met. What was that?" Ronan was quiet for a long moment, as though weighing how much to say. "Something I wasn't expecting," he finally admitted. "Something I'm still trying to understand myself." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't, but it's the truth. And right now, it's all I have to offer." Elena studied him, searching for deception and finding none. Whatever this connection was, he seemed just as uncertain about it as she was, which offered some small measure of comfort even as it raised more questions than it answered. "My father sold me," she said suddenly, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "For a debt. He handed me over to strangers like I was worth nothing more than the price they were paying." Ronan's expression darkened, though his voice remained gentle. "Then your father made a grave mistake, and not just in terms of judgment. You don't know him, maybe he had no other choice." "There's always another choice," Ronan said firmly. "Some people simply refuse to look for it when the easier path involves sacrificing someone else instead of themselves." Elena looked away, watching the walls of the kingdom grow larger as they approached. She wanted to defend her father, some instinctive loyalty rising up despite everything, but she couldn't find the words to justify what he had done. There was no explanation that made selling his own daughter acceptable, regardless of circumstance. "What happens now?" she asked instead, changing the subject rather than dwelling on wounds too fresh to examine. "Now you rest," Ronan said. "You've been through more in one night than most people experience in years. Everything else can wait until you've had time to breathe." They reached the kingdom's outer gates as the sun fully rose over the horizon. Guards stationed along the walls straightening immediately at the sight of their king's return. Elena felt dozens of eyes on her as they passed through, curious and assessing, and she found herself sitting straighter in the saddle despite her exhaustion, unwilling to appear as fragile as she felt. Callum rode up alongside them as they moved through the gates. "Word will spread quickly that you've returned with a guest," he said quietly to Ronan. "People will have questions." "Let them ask," Ronan replied. "I don't intend to hide anything about what happened tonight." Elena glanced between the two men, sensing an undercurrent of concern in Callum's tone that Ronan seemed determined to brush aside. Whatever complications her presence might create within this kingdom, Ronan appeared unwilling to let them dictate his decisions, a stubbornness she found both reassuring and slightly unsettling given how little she understood about the politics she had just been thrown into. As they rode deeper into the kingdom, past home slowly waking to the new day, Elena allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, to acknowledge that she had survived a night that could easily have ended in tragedy. She was free from Draven, free from the post where she had been bound as bait, but she understood with growing clarity that her troubles were far from over. She had traded one uncertain fate for another, and whatever waited for her within these walls, she would need every bit of strength she had left to face it. Beside her, Ronan rode in thoughtful silence, his own mind clearly occupied with concerns beyond simply the fight they had survived. Elena wondered what exactly he was thinking, what this strange pull between them truly meant, and what challenges lay ahead now that her fate had become tangled with a king's in ways neither of them fully understood yet. A sharp knock at the door pulled Elena out of a sleep so deep she had forgotten, for a moment, where she was. She sat up quickly, heart racing, before her eyes adjusted to the unfamiliar room around her. Soft morning light filtering through tall windows, fine furniture arranged with quiet elegance. The memories returned in a rush, the clearing, the fire, Ronan, the kingdom. She had been given a room within the palace the night before, though exhaustion had claimed her almost the moment she lay down, leaving little memory of the space itself. "Come in," she called, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. A young woman entered, carrying a tray with food and fresh water, her expression polite but curious. "I'm Nora," she said. "I've been asked to look after you while you're here. There's breakfast, and a bath has been prepared if you'd like it." Elena accepted the tray gratefully, aware of how hollow her stomach felt after the events of the previous night. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this." Nora hesitated near the door, glancing at Elena with an expression that suggested curiosity outweighing her professional restraint. "May I ask something?" "Of course. Is it true the king fought off an entire ambush to bring you here?" Elena set down the piece of bread she had just picked up. "Something like that," she said carefully, "though I wouldn't call it entire, maybe a dozen." Nora's eyes widened slightly before she caught herself, smoothing her expression back into professionalism. "People are already talking about it. The whole palace is curious about the woman he brought back with him." The words settled uncomfortably in Elena's stomach. She hadn't considered, in the chaos of the previous night, what it might mean for a king to arrive home with an unexpected guest, especially one rescued under such dramatic circumstances. Whatever quiet life she might have hoped to recover in this new place, it seemed unlikely to remain quiet for long. "What kind of talking?" she asked. Nora shifted uncomfortably. "Just curiosity, mostly. Though there are always some who assume the worst about strangers, especially strangers connected to matters involving rogues." Elena understood the implication without needing it spelled out further. Whatever had happened to her, whatever suffering she had endured, some people would look at her circumstances and see only suspicion, only a story convenient for gossip rather than genuine sympathy. "I'll leave you to eat," Nora said, sensing the shift in mood. "The bath is through that door whenever you're ready. Someone will come by later with clothing more suited to the season." Once alone, Elena ate slowly, her mind turning over everything Nora had said. She thought about her father again, about the pack she had left behind, wondering if anyone there even realized she was gone, or if her absence had simply been accepted as the price paid for whatever debt had needed settling. After bathing and dressing in clothes left for her, simple but well made, Elena found herself restless within the confines of her room, curiosity eventually overcoming caution. She stepped into the hallway, intending only to look around, and found herself quickly lost within the palace's winding corridors. "You look like someone trying very hard to appear as though she isn't lost," came a voice from behind her. Elena turned to find Ronan approaching, dressed more formally than she had seen him the night before, though faint bruises remained visible along his jaw from the fight. Something in her chest tightened slightly at the sight of him, an echo of that same strange pull from before. "I might have wandered further than intended," she admitted. "Come," he said. "I'll walk with you." They moved together through the corridors, Ronan pointing out various rooms and their purposes as they passed, though Elena found herself only half listening, more focused on the ease with which conversation seemed to flow between them despite everything that had happened. "Nora mentioned people are talking," she said eventually, "about me being here." Ronan's expression didn't change, though something in his posture straightened slightly. "People talk about everything. It rarely matters what's true." "It matters to me," Elena said. I've had enough of being talked about like an object without a voice of her own. First by my father, now by an entire palace of strangers. Ronan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. No one within these walls will treat you as an object, not while I have any say in it. You can't control what people think, Elena said. No, he agreed. But I can control how they're allowed to act on those thoughts, at least within my own court. Before she could respond, footsteps approached from further down the corridor, and a woman appeared, elegant in bearing, her expression carefully composed in a way that immediately put Elena on alert. She recognized the type instantly, the kind of practiced neutrality that concealed judgment rather than eliminating it. Your Majesty, the woman said, inclining her head toward Ronan, before turning her attention to Elena, gaze sweeping over her with obvious assessment. And this must be the guest everyone's been discussing. Priscilla, Ronan said, his tone noticeably cooler than it had been a moment before. This is Elena. Of course, Priscilla said smoothly. The one rescued from the rogues. Quite the dramatic entrance into court, I imagine. Though I suppose circumstances beyond one's control shouldn't reflect poorly on someone. The words were polite on their surface, yet Elena heard the underlying implication clearly enough. Whatever had happened to her wasn't something within her control, yet Priscilla's tone suggested it might reflect poorly regardless. I appreciate the sentiment, Elena said carefully, refusing to let the woman see how the comment had landed. Priscilla's smile remained fixed in place. I'm sure the whole court will extend the same understanding. In time. Though these things do have a way of following people, don't they? Reputation is a fragile thing. That's enough, Ronan said, his voice carrying a firmness that left no room for further comment. Elena is a guest in this kingdom, and she will be treated with the respect that requires. Priscilla's expression flickered, briefly, before smoothing back into practiced neutrality. Of course, Your Majesty, I meant no disrespect. She offered a shallow bow, before continuing down the corridor, leaving an uncomfortable silence in her wake. Ignore her, Ronan said once she had gone. Priscilla enjoys stirring discomfort wherever she finds an opportunity. She's not entirely wrong, though, Elena said quietly. People will wonder about me, about what happened, about why I'm here, about whether I deserve any of the kindness you're offering. You survived something most people couldn't have, Ronan said. That's not a mark against you. It's proof of exactly the opposite. Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the reassurance at face value. But years of feeling undervalued within her own pack had left scars that didn't heal, simply because someone kind offered comforting words. Still, something about the conviction in his voice made it easier to breathe than it had been moments before. Thank you, she said finally, for standing up for me back there. You won't need me to do it forever, Ronan said. But for as long as you do, I will. They continued walking, and Elena found her earlier tension slowly easing, replaced by a cautious curiosity about this kingdom she now found herself part of. However uncertain her place within it remained. Whatever whispers followed her through these halls, whatever suspicion lingered in Priscilla's calculated smile, she was determined not to let it define how she carried herself. She had survived being sold as bait, survived an ambush meant to end in death, and walked away from that clearing on her own feet, free for the first time in longer than she cared to admit. Whatever challenges waited within this palace, she intended to face them the same way, refusing to be diminished by anyone's judgment. Least of all a woman whose smile hid daggers sharper than any blade Draven's men had carried the night before. The sound of raised voices reached Elena before she even entered the council chamber, and she froze just outside the door, recognizing her own name spoken in tones that carried more concern than kindness. You cannot simply bring a stranger into the palace and expect the court to accept her without question, an older voice was saying, tight with frustration. She comes from a pack we know nothing about, rescued under circumstances tied directly to Draven. A man who has caused this kingdom trouble for years. She was a victim, Ronan's voice replied, steady but firm, not a conspirator. That may be true, the older voice continued, but perception matters as much as truth in matters of court. Some will wonder if her presence here was arranged, if Draven intended for you to bring her back with you all along. Elena's stomach turned at the implication. She pressed her hand against the cool stone wall beside the door, steadying herself against the sudden wave of anger and hurt the words produced. As if surviving that night hadn't been enough, now she was expected to defend herself against suspicion that she had somehow been part of the very plot designed to hurt her. That's absurd, Ronan said sharply. I saw the rope marks on her wrists myself. I fought through a dozen men to reach her. If this was some elaborate plan on her part, it was one that nearly cost her life to execute. I'm simply stating what others will think, the older voice replied, more gently now. You know how quickly rumor spreads. and how difficult it becomes to correct once it takes root. Elena had heard enough. She pushed the door open before she could talk herself out of it, stepping into the chamber with her chin lifted despite the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Several pairs of eyes turned toward her immediately, surprise evident on most faces. Ronan stood near the head of a long table, and beside him sat an older man with silver hair and sharp eyes, clearly the source of the voice she had overheard. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Elena said, though her tone suggested otherwise, "but I'd rather address these concerns directly than have them discussed behind my back." The older man's expression shifted into something more careful. "Forgive me if my words caused offense. I meant only to raise practical concerns that others within this court might voice less diplomatically." "Then let me answer them plainly," Elena said, stepping further into the room. "I did not arrange to be sold as bait. I did not know Draven's plan, did not know his name, until the night he had me tied to a post in the middle of the woods. Whatever suspicions exist about my presence here, I understand them, but I won't stand quietly by while people decide who I am, without ever asking me directly." Silence followed her words, several council members exchanging glances, clearly unaccustomed to being addressed so directly by someone occupying such an uncertain position within their court. "That took courage," the older man finally said, something like respect entering his tone. "I am Edwin, an advisor to the king. I meant no personal insult, only caution, born from experience." "I understand caution," Elena said. "I simply ask that it not become cruelty disguised as concern." Edwin nodded slowly. "A fair request." Ronan watched the exchange with an expression Elena couldn't quite read, something between pride and worry, as though uncertain whether to be pleased by her boldness or concerned about the attention it might draw. "If there are no further concerns," Ronan said, addressing the room, "Elena remains a guest of this court, under my protection, and will be treated accordingly." The council members offered murmured agreement, though Elena could sense the reservation still lingering beneath their compliance. Trust, she understood, would not be earned through a single speech, no matter how boldly delivered. It would take time, consistency, and perhaps circumstances entirely beyond her control before this court accepted her as anything other than a complication tied to Ronan's rescue mission. Once the meeting concluded and the chamber emptied, Ronan approached her, his expression softening. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Elena said. "I've spent my whole life letting other people decide things about me without giving me a voice. I won't do that again. Not here, not anywhere." Something warm flickered across Ronan's face. "Your father's loss," he said quietly. "My gain, apparently." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks at the comment, unsure how to respond to something that sounded almost like a compliment wrapped inside an observation about her strength. "Edwin isn't wrong to be cautious," she said instead, redirecting the conversation. "I understand why people would question my presence here." "Understanding doesn't mean accepting unfair treatment," Ronan replied. "There's a difference between reasonable caution and using suspicion as an excuse for cruelty." They walked together toward the palace gardens, the fresh air a welcome relief after the tension of the council chamber. Elena found herself relaxing slightly as they moved among carefully tended flower beds, the scent of blooming plants a gentler contrast to the heaviness of the conversation they had just left behind. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "Of course." "Why does it matter so much to you, my reputation, my treatment here? You barely know me." Ronan was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully before answering. "There's something between us," he finally said. "Something I felt the moment our eyes met in that clearing. I don't fully understand it yet, but I know it's not something I'm willing to ignore." "What if it's just relief?" Elena asked, though even as she said it, she knew the words rang hollow. Relief from being rescued, or from finally succeeding at protecting someone. "Is that what you believe it is?" Elena hesitated, unable to lie convincingly even to herself. "No," she admitted quietly. "It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like something older, something that doesn't need explaining, even though I can't explain it." Ronan nodded, as though her answer confirmed something he already suspected. "In my culture, there are stories about connections like this. A pull between two people that exists beyond simple circumstance, something recognized rather than created." "Fated mates," Elena said quietly, recalling old stories her mother used to tell before she passed, tales she had dismissed as folklore meant for children rather than something with any basis in reality. "You've heard of it." "Stories," Elena said, "nothing more." "Perhaps," Ronan said, "or perhaps some stories exist because they're true, and we simply forget that until we experience them ourselves." Elena studied him, searching for any sign that this was simply a tactic, some elaborate manipulation designed to secure her loyalty or trust. She found nothing but sincerity in his expression, an openness that matched the strange certainty she felt whenever she allowed herself to acknowledge the pull between them honestly. "I don't know what to do with that information," she admitted. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," Ronan said gently. "Whatever this is between us, it doesn't require immediate answers. We have time to understand it together, if you're willing." Elena considered his words, considered everything that had happened in the days since her father had betrayed her trust so completely. Perhaps this connection, whatever its true nature, was the one good thing to emerge from an otherwise devastating turn of events. Perhaps it was worth exploring, carefully, patiently, without rushing toward conclusions neither of them were fully prepared to reach. "Together," she repeated softly. "I think I'd like that." The garden around them seemed to hold its breath in the quiet that followed, sunlight filtering through leaves overhead, and for the first time since that terrible night in the woods, Elena felt something close to hope taking root where fear had lived only days before. The wine goblet shattered against the stone floor before Elena even realized her hand had knocked it from the table. She stared at the shards scattered across the polished surface, her pulse racing, the whispered conversation she had just overheard from the corridor still echoing in her ears. Nora rushed in at the sound, eyes widening at the mess. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Elena said quickly, though her voice betrayed the tension coiled inside her. "Just clumsy." Nora knelt to gather the broken pieces, glancing up occasionally with obvious concern, though she said nothing further, clearly sensing that whatever had unsettled Elena wasn't something easily explained away. Once alone again, Elena replayed the overheard conversation in her mind. Two servants, unaware she stood close enough to hear, discussing rumors circulating through the palace that Priscilla had been quietly gathering support among certain council members, suggesting that Elena's continued presence represented a liability rather than an asset to the kingdom's stability. Worse, one of the servants had mentioned whispers that questioned whether the king's growing attachment to her was clouding his judgment on matters of state. It had been 3 weeks since the night in the clearing, 3 weeks of slowly settling into palace life, learning names and customs, navigating the careful dance of a court uncertain how to categorize her. Some had warmed to her presence, charmed by her directness during that first council meeting. Others, like Priscilla, seemed determined to undermine whatever fragile acceptance she managed to build. A knock sounded at her door, and Elena straightened quickly, smoothing her dress before answering. Ronan stood in the doorway, his expression immediately shifting to concern at whatever he saw in her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Elena said automatically, then caught herself, remembering her earlier resolution not to hide behind polite deflections. "Actually something. I overheard servants talking. About Priscilla, about rumors she's spreading, about council members questioning whether your judgment has been compromised because of me." Ronan's jaw tightened. Priscilla has always enjoyed maneuvering for influence. This isn't new. "But it's happening because of me," Elena said. "I'm creating problems for you. Problems that existed long before I arrived, and will continue long after, except now they're centered around my presence instead of something else." "You're not creating problems," Ronan said firmly. "Priscilla is using your presence as a convenient excuse to advance agendas she's held for years. If it wasn't you, it would be some other justification." Elena wasn't entirely convinced, though she appreciated the reassurance. What does she want? What's her actual goal in all this? Ronan hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Priscilla has ambitions for her family's influence within the court. There was an expectation, before you arrived, that certain alliances might be formed through more traditional arrangements." Understanding dawned slowly. "She wanted you to marry someone from her family." "There were suggestions along those lines, yes," Ronan admitted. "Nothing I ever agreed to. But expectations don't always require agreement to take root and grow. And now I've disrupted those plans." "You haven't disrupted anything I ever intended to pursue," Ronan said. "But yes, your presence has made certain ambitions considerably less likely to succeed, which explains a great deal about Priscilla's recent behavior." Elena sat down slowly, processing this new layer of complexity added to an already complicated situation. She had assumed the suspicion surrounding her stemmed purely from circumstances tied to Draven and the Rogues, not from an entirely separate political rivalry that had existed long before she ever arrived. "This isn't going to simply fade away, is it?" she asked. "Not on its own," Ronan admitted. "But that doesn't mean we're without options." "What kind of options?" Ronan sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been considering making our connection public, formally acknowledging you as my intended mate, rather than simply a guest under my protection. It would remove any ambiguity about your position here, and make it considerably harder for anyone to undermine your standing through rumor alone. Elena's chest tightened at the suggestion, equal parts hope and fear coursing through her. Are you certain that's what you want? Not just as a political strategy, but genuinely. I've been certain since the night in that clearing, Ronan said quietly. I've simply been giving you time to reach your own certainty before pushing the matter forward. Elena studied him, searching for any hesitation, any sign that this was motivated more by convenience than genuine feeling. She found none, only the same steady sincerity that had characterized every conversation between them since that terrifying night weeks ago. I feel it too, she admitted softly. This pull, this connection, I've tried explaining it away as gratitude, as simple attachment born from crisis, but it doesn't fade the way those explanations suggest it should. Then perhaps it's time we stopped pretending it's anything other than what it actually is, Ronan said. Before Elena could respond, a sharp knock interrupted them, and Callum entered without waiting for permission, his expression grave enough that both of them immediately straightened with concern. What's happened? Ronan asked. There's been a security breach, Callum said. Someone within the palace has been sharing information about your movements, specific patrol routes and travel plans, with parties outside these walls. Elena's stomach dropped. Draven? We believe so, Callum said. The pattern matches too closely to be coincidence. Someone close to the crown has been feeding him details, likely for weeks, possibly longer. Ronan's expression darkened considerably. How long have you known this? We only confirmed it this morning, comparing patrol schedules against known movements of Draven's remaining followers. Someone within these walls wants him to succeed in whatever plans he's still pursuing. Do we know who? Elena asked. Not yet, Callum admitted. But the list of people with access to that kind of detailed information is not large. We'll need to investigate carefully, without alerting whoever is responsible that we're aware of the leak. Ronan stood, his earlier warmth replaced by a hardened focus Elena hadn't seen since the night of the rescue itself. Then we start immediately. I want a full review of everyone with access to my schedule, cross-referenced against anyone who might have connections to Draven, or reasons to want him to succeed. Understood, Callum said, though his eyes flicked briefly toward Elena before he left the room, an unspoken question lingering in his expression that made her uneasy. He suspects me, Elena said once they were alone again, doesn't he? Callum is cautious by nature, Ronan said carefully. It's part of what makes him good at his job. But no, I don't believe he suspects you specifically. He's simply aware that trust within this palace has become more complicated since your arrival, and he's trying to account for every possibility. Even if I have nothing to do with it, my presence still complicates everything, Elena said quietly. Maybe Edwin was right to be cautious. Or maybe, Ronan said, taking her hand gently. This proves you were never the true problem in the first place. Someone within my own court has been working against me for longer than you've even existed within these walls. Whatever danger surrounds us now, it existed before you arrived, and would exist regardless of whether you were here or not. Elena wanted to believe him fully, wanted to release the guilt tightening in her chest, but uncertainty lingered nonetheless. Someone close to the crown was actively working to see Ronan harmed, possibly killed, and whoever that person was, remained hidden among the very people she had spent weeks trying to earn acceptance from. We need to find them, she said firmly, pushing aside her own doubts in favor of practical determination. Whoever is doing this, they need to be stopped before they succeed at whatever they're planning next. Agreed, Ronan said, and we'll do it together. Outside her window, the sun continued its slow descent toward evening, casting long shadows across the palace grounds, and somewhere within these very walls, a traitor moved freely among people who trusted them completely, planning whatever came next in a scheme that had already nearly cost Ronan his life once before. The list of names spread across the table seemed impossibly long for something meant to narrow down a single traitor. Elena leaned over the parchment, scanning the columns of household staff, guards and advisors who had access to Ronan's schedule over the past several months. Callum stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, clearly frustrated by how little progress they had made despite days of careful investigation. Anyone on this list could have passed information to Draven, Callum said. Servants overhear conversations. Guards know patrol routes because they walk them. Advisors have access to nearly everything discussed in council. Narrowing this down through elimination alone could take months. We don't have months, Ronan said, pacing near the window. If Draven is planning another attempt, he won't wait indefinitely. Elena studied the names more carefully, an idea slowly forming. What if we stopped looking at opportunity and started looking at motive instead? Not everyone on this list would benefit from your death or embarrassment. Someone specific stands to gain something from what's happening. Such as? Callum asked. Priscilla, Elena said carefully. You mentioned her family had ambitions tied to a marriage alliance that never happened. If Ronan were removed, or discredited, wouldn't that change the political landscape considerably? Ronan frowned. Priscilla is difficult and manipulative, certainly, but treason is a considerable leap from political maneuvering. Maybe, Elena said, but it's worth investigating rather than dismissing outright simply because the alternative seems more comfortable. Callum considered this, tapping his fingers against the table thoughtfully. It wouldn't hurt to examine her connections more closely. If nothing comes of it, we've lost little time. If something does, we may have found exactly what we're looking for. They spent the following days quietly investigating Priscilla's known associates, tracing correspondence where possible, questioning household staff with careful discretion, designed not to alert her to the scrutiny. Elena found herself drawn into the process more deeply than she expected, her earlier resentment toward Priscilla's cruelty transforming into something closer to focused determination to uncover the truth, whatever it might reveal. There's something odd here, Callum said one evening, reviewing documents spread across his desk. Priscilla has been meeting regularly with a merchant named Dorian, someone with known trade connections extending beyond our borders. Nothing inherently suspicious on its own, but the frequency of these meetings increased significantly around the same time the leaked information began appearing. Trade connections that might extend to Draven's territory? Ronan asked. Possibly, Callum said. I'd need more direct evidence before making any accusations, but it's a connection worth pursuing further. Elena felt a flicker of vindication at the confirmation, though it was quickly tempered by the seriousness of what they were potentially uncovering. If Priscilla truly was involved in a conspiracy against Ronan, the implications extended far beyond simple court rivalry, into something considerably more dangerous. We need proof, Ronan said. Suspicion alone won't be enough to bring formal charges against someone with her standing in court. If we accuse her without solid evidence, we risk making her more careful, more likely to cover her tracks completely. Then we need to catch her in the act somehow, Elena suggested, or find something that connects her directly to the information that reached Draven. Callum nodded slowly. There's a council meeting scheduled in 2 days regarding increased security measures along the eastern border. If we deliberately include a small piece of false information within those discussions, something specific enough to trace if it appears elsewhere, we might be able to determine definitively whether Priscilla is our source. A trap of our own, Ronan said, something grim satisfaction entering his expression. Exactly, Callum said. If Draven's men suddenly know about eastern border details that only exist because we planted them deliberately within a meeting Priscilla attended, we'll have our answer. The plan was set into motion carefully over the following 2 days, Ronan and Callum working to ensure the false information appeared credible enough to be believed, while Elena focused on maintaining normal appearances, attending the same social functions and court gatherings she had grown accustomed to, careful not to betray any hint of the investigation unfolding beneath the surface. During one such gathering, Priscilla approached her directly, something unusually warm in her expression that immediately put Elena on guard. You seem to be settling in rather well, Priscilla said, taking a seat beside her with practiced grace. The kingdom appears to be growing quite fond of you. Some more than others, Elena replied carefully. Priscilla laughed lightly. I suppose my earlier concerns may have come across as harsher than intended. I only ever wanted what's best for this kingdom. I understand, Elena said, forcing warmth into her tone despite the suspicion churning beneath her calm exterior. These are uncertain times for everyone. Indeed, Priscilla agreed, her eyes drifting briefly toward where Ronan stood across the room, deep in conversation with several council members. Especially with security concerns along our borders becoming more pressing. I understand there was discussion recently about increased patrols to the east. Elena kept her expression neutral despite the way her pulse quickened at the mention. This was exactly the information they had planted, and Priscilla was raising it herself, unprompted, within casual conversation. I wouldn't know the details, Elena said carefully. Those discussions happen in council, not somewhere I'm typically included. Of course, Priscilla said smoothly. Silly of me to assume otherwise. The conversation moved to other topics shortly afterward, but Elena couldn't shake the unease that lingered from Priscilla's specific mention of the eastern patrols. It proved nothing definitively, yet it confirmed the woman had access to information discussed within that particular meeting, exactly as suspected. That evening, Elena relayed the exchange to Ronan and Callum, watching as their expressions shifted from cautious hope to something more resolute. It's not conclusive, Callum said, but combined with everything else we've gathered, it strengthens the case considerably. We need to see if that information actually reaches Draven, Ronan said. If our scouts report increased rogue activity specifically around the eastern border in the coming days, matching the false details we planted. We'll have all the confirmation necessary. They waited anxiously over the following days, Elena finding it increasingly difficult to maintain normal composure while investigation into Priscilla's potential betrayal unfolded quietly behind the scenes. Every interaction with the woman now carried an undercurrent of tension, knowledge she couldn't yet act on weighing heavily against her. Finally, reports arrived from scouts stationed along the eastern border, confirming increased rogue movement precisely in the areas described within the falsified information. Movement that made no logical sense unless someone had specifically directed Draven's remaining followers there, based on details discussed exclusively within that closed council meeting. "That's it," Ronan said, reading the scout's report with grim satisfaction. "We have our confirmation." "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now," Callum said, "we decide how best to confront her, and how to ensure she doesn't have the opportunity to escape or destroy evidence before we can hold her properly accountable." Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and unease at the realization that they had finally identified their traitor, knowing that whatever came next would involve confrontation, consequences, and likely considerable turmoil within a court still struggling to fully accept her own presence. But beneath the unease, she felt something stronger, a growing confidence in her own ability to contribute meaningfully to protecting the kingdom and the man beside her, rather than simply existing as someone requiring protection herself. Whatever came next, she intended to face it standing firmly beside Ronan, no longer merely a victim rescued from tragedy, but an active participant in ensuring justice was properly served. Priscilla's composed expression cracked the moment guards stepped into the council chamber and closed the doors behind them. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, rising from her seat, her eyes darting between Ronan, Callum, and the armed guards now positioned near every exit. "Sit down, Priscilla," Ronan said, his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument. She remained standing a moment longer, defiance flickering across her features, before finally lowering herself back into her chair, though her posture remained rigid with tension. Elena stood near the wall, close enough to witness everything unfold, invited by Ronan specifically because of the role she had played in uncovering the truth. "We know about your meetings with Dorian," Callum said, placing a folder of documents onto the table before her. "We know about the eastern border information that reached Draven's men within days of being discussed exclusively within a closed council session you attended." Priscilla's face paled slightly, though she recovered quickly, forcing her expression back into practiced calm. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but I assure you, whatever conclusions you've drawn are mistaken." "Are they?" Ronan asked. "Because the pattern is remarkably consistent. Every piece of sensitive information that reached Draven correlates directly with meetings and discussions you were present for." "Coincidence," Priscilla said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Ronan said, "except we deliberately planted false information within the most recent meeting, information that existed nowhere else, shared with no one outside that room. Yet somehow, Draven's men appeared exactly where that false information indicated they might, within days of the meeting concluding." Silence stretched through the chamber, heavy and damning. Elena watched as the last remnants of Priscilla's composure finally crumbled, her shoulders sagging slightly as the weight of the evidence against her became impossible to deny convincingly any longer. "You don't understand what it's like," Priscilla said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. "Watching everything my family worked toward for generations slip away because a king decided his own preferences mattered more than strategic alliance. So you chose to work against me instead," Ronan said, "to potentially see me killed, simply because a marriage alliance you favored didn't come to pass." "I never wanted you dead," Priscilla said quickly. "Only weakened, humiliated perhaps, enough that certain arrangements might still become possible despite your resistance to them." "And if weakening me resulted in death instead," Ronan asked, "did that possibility ever concern you?" Priscilla's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. "Draven wasn't working for you," Elena said suddenly, stepping forward as a realization struck her. "He was using you, using the information you provided to advance his own goals, which had nothing to do with your family's political ambitions, and everything to do with eliminating a king he saw as an obstacle to his own power." Priscilla looked at her sharply. "That's not, isn't it?" Elena pressed. "Draven told me himself, the night I was tied to that post, that the trap wasn't really about me at all. It was about drawing Ronan into a situation where he could be killed. Your information made that possible. Whatever you believed you were accomplishing for your family, you were simply a tool being used by someone with far more dangerous intentions." The realization visibly landed on Priscilla, her expression shifting from defensive anger, into something closer to genuine horror, as the full scope of her actions became clear. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I truly believed I was simply creating complications, opportunities for negotiation. I never imagined he intended actual harm." "Intentions rarely matter once consequences unfold," Ronan said, though something in his tone had softened slightly at the evident sincerity of her shock. "You provided information that nearly cost me my life, and nearly cost Elena hers as well. Whatever you believed you were doing, the results speak for themselves." Priscilla lowered her head, and for a long moment, no one spoke, the weight of everything settling heavily across the chamber. Finally, she looked up again, something resigned in her expression. "What happens to me now?" Ronan considered the question carefully. "Treason carries severe consequences under our laws. However, given your cooperation now in confirming what you've done, and the apparent absence of intent toward my death specifically, I'm willing to consider exile rather than more severe punishment. You will leave this kingdom, forfeit all standing and connections within it, and never return." Priscilla absorbed this, something like relief mixing with evident grief at the loss of everything she had known. "And my family?" "Your family's ambitions will need to find another path forward," Ronan said. "One that doesn't involve betraying the crown they've served for generations." Guards escorted Priscilla from the chamber shortly afterward, her earlier arrogance replaced entirely by quiet defeat. Once she had gone, the tension within the room slowly began to ease, replaced by a cautious relief that the immediate threat had finally been addressed. "That still leaves Dorian," Callum said, "and Draven himself, who remains at large despite everything." "One problem at a time," Ronan said, though his expression suggested he hadn't forgotten the larger threat still looming beyond the palace walls. "For now, at least we've closed the gap that allowed information to leak so freely." Elena felt the tension in her own shoulders finally begin to release, though a new thought had been forming throughout the confrontation, one she hadn't quite voiced yet. "Ronan," she said carefully, "Draven mentioned my father's debt, the reason I was handed over in the first place. What if that debt wasn't entirely genuine? What if it was manufactured specifically to create an opportunity for exactly what happened?" Ronan's expression sharpened with sudden attention. "You think your father's situation was engineered by Draven himself?" "I don't know," Elena admitted, "but it would explain a great deal. My father's pack has struggled for years, but the specific debt that led to me being sold seemed to appear suddenly, without much explanation given to me about its origins. If Draven orchestrated circumstances specifically to create leverage against my father, using me as the eventual outcome, it would mean this entire situation was planned far more carefully than any of us initially realized." Callum frowned thoughtfully. "It's a troubling possibility, but not an unreasonable one given everything else we've uncovered about Draven's patience and planning." "If that's true," Ronan said slowly, "then this goes back further than we thought, which means understanding exactly how it started might be the key to finally ending it." Elena felt a familiar resolve settling over her, the same stubborn determination that had carried her through that terrifying night in the clearing. "Then I need to go back," she said. "I need to speak with my father directly, and find out exactly what happened before that debt ever came to exist." Ronan studied her carefully. "That won't be easy, returning to the place where you were betrayed." "No," Elena agreed. "But if there's a chance it helps us understand Draven's plans more fully, and helps protect this kingdom from whatever he intends next, then it's a conversation I need to have, regardless of how difficult it might be." Whatever fear lingered at the thought of confronting her father again, Elena refused to let it stop her from pursuing answers that might finally bring this entire dangerous situation to a close, once and for all. Gareth Voss dropped the cup he was holding the moment he saw his daughter standing in the doorway of his home. It shattered against the floor, forgotten instantly as he stared at her, disbelief and something like shame flickering across his weathered features. Elena stood tall in the entrance, flanked by two of Ronan's guards, her expression carefully composed despite the storm of emotion churning beneath the surface. "Elena," he said finally, his voice hoarse. You thought I was dead," Elena finished for him, "or gone somewhere far enough away that you'd never have to face what you did." Gareth's shoulders sagged, guilt evident in every line of his posture. "I didn't have a choice." "Everyone keeps saying that," Elena said, stepping further into the house that had once been her home, now feeling strange and unfamiliar under the weight of everything that had happened since she last stood within these walls. "Yet somehow, there's always a choice. You simply chose the one that didn't cost you anything personally." "It cost me everything," Gareth said. "You were my daughter. Do you think handing you over was easy?" "I think you did it anyway," Elena replied evenly, "which tells me everything I need to know about how difficult it truly was for you." Gareth flinched at the accusation, though he didn't argue further, understanding perhaps that no defense would soften the reality of what he had done. Elena took a breath, forcing her personal grievances aside for the moment, focusing on the reason she had actually come. "I need to know about the debt," she said. "The one Draven used to justify taking me. Where did it come from?" Gareth's expression shifted, confusion briefly overtaking guilt. "It came from trade agreements gone wrong, losses the pack couldn't recover from. Why does this matter now?" "Because I think it was manufactured," Elena said. "Deliberately created to give Draven leverage over you, leverage that would eventually lead to exactly what happened." Gareth's face paled slightly. "That's not possible. The debt was real, tracked through legitimate transactions over several years." "Legitimate according to whom?" Elena pressed. "Who introduced these trade agreements in the first place? Who benefited from the pack's losses mounting over time?" Gareth sat down slowly, clearly working through implications he hadn't previously considered. "There was a merchant," he said finally. "Someone who approached us several years ago with opportunities that seemed promising initially. Trade routes, resource-sharing agreements. Everything seemed legitimate at the time. What was his name?" Elena asked, already suspecting the answer before it came. "Dorian," Gareth said. "Why? Do you know him?" Elena's stomach tightened at the confirmation. Dorian, the same merchant connected to Priscilla, the same name that had surfaced during their investigation into the palace leak. The connections were beginning to form a clearer picture than she had anticipated, one that suggested Draven's plans extended far wider, and had been in motion for far longer than anyone had initially realized. "He's connected to Draven," Elena said. "The same man who orchestrated the trap I was used for. It seems likely he deliberately created circumstances designed to weaken this pack financially, specifically to create the exact situation that led to my being sold." Gareth's face had gone entirely pale now, the full weight of what he had unknowingly participated in finally becoming clear. "I had no idea. I truly believed those trade losses were simply misfortune, poor decisions on my part, rather than deliberate manipulation." "That's exactly what he intended you to believe," Elena said, some of her earlier anger softening slightly at the genuine shock evident on her father's face. "You were manipulated as thoroughly as I was, just through different means." "That doesn't excuse what I did," Gareth said quietly. "Regardless of how the debt came to exist, I still made the choice to hand you over, rather than find another way, rather than fight harder to protect you." Elena studied her father, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, not simply as the man who had betrayed her, but as someone who had been caught within a scheme far larger and more calculated than he ever understood, while still bearing genuine responsibility for the choice he ultimately made. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it, and there's a difference between excuse and explanation." "What happens now?" Gareth asked. "Now, this information goes back to Ronan," Elena said. "It confirms Draven has been planning this for years, manipulating circumstances specifically to create the trap that nearly cost him his life. Understanding the full scope of his methods might be the key to finally stopping him." Gareth nodded slowly, though something else seemed to weigh on him still. "Elena, I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything that's happened, but I need you to know, whatever choice I made, it wasn't because I valued you any less than I should have. It was because I saw no other path forward, however wrong that judgment ultimately proved to be." Elena considered his words carefully, feeling the old hurt still present but softened somewhat by everything she had learned since that terrible night. "I don't know if I can forgive what happened," she said honestly. "Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But I understand now that you were also deceived, manipulated into circumstances that made an already difficult decision seem like the only option available." "That's more than I deserve," Gareth said quietly. "Perhaps," Elena said. "But I'd rather understand the full truth than continue carrying anger towards someone who was also a victim of the same scheme that hurt me, even if his choices still caused me real harm." She turned to leave, the guards falling into step behind her, but paused at the doorway, looking back at her father one final time. "I hope you find a way to rebuild, away from whatever influence Dorian and Draven have had over this pack. You deserve the chance to make better choices going forward, even if you failed to make one when it mattered most for me." Gareth watched her leave with an expression caught between grief and something like fragile hope, understanding perhaps that this conversation, however painful, represented more grace than he had any right to expect given everything that had happened. As Elena rode back toward Ronan's kingdom, the information she carried felt heavier than she expected, confirmation that Draven's ambitions extended far beyond a single ambush, reaching back years into careful, patient manipulation, designed to eventually place both her and Ronan exactly where he wanted them. Whatever came next in confronting him fully, she understood now that ending this threat would require addressing not just Draven himself, but the entire network of manipulation and deceit he had built to serve his purposes. She arrived back at the palace as evening settled over the grounds, finding Ronan waiting for her return, with visible relief and anticipation. "What did you learn?" he asked immediately. "Everything," Elena said, "and it's worse than we thought." Dorian's warehouse burned faster than anyone expected, flames climbing the wooden beams as Ronan's guards moved swiftly through the chaos, securing exits before anyone inside could escape into the night. Elena watched from a safe distance, her heart pounding as the operation unfolded exactly as planned. Following her father's revelation about Dorian's manipulation, Ronan and Callum had spent days tracing the merchant's activities, uncovering a network of hidden agreements and secret meeting places that finally led them to this warehouse, situated at the edge of the kingdom, serving as a base for coordinating between Dorian's trade manipulations and Draven's remaining forces. Guards emerged from the smoke moments later, dragging several figures with them, including Dorian himself, coughing and disoriented but very much alive. Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering anxiety as she watched him restrained, understanding that capturing him represented only part of dismantling the threat Draven had built over the years. "Where is Draven?" Ronan demanded, stepping forward as Dorian was brought before him. Dorian, despite his circumstances, managed a thin, defiant smile. "Somewhere you'll never find him, Your Majesty." "We'll see about that," Ronan said, his tone carrying a coldness Elena hadn't heard from him before, forged through weeks of investigation and mounting frustration at how deeply this conspiracy had rooted itself into circumstances surrounding both his kingdom and Elena's former pack. The interrogation that followed revealed pieces of information slowly, Dorian resisting at first before the weight of evidence against him made denial increasingly pointless. Piece by piece, a clearer picture emerged of Draven's ambitions, not simply revenge or opportunism, but a calculated attempt to weaken multiple packs simultaneously, creating chaos and vulnerability that he intended to exploit for his own rise to power across the wider region. "He's been planning this for years," Callum said, reviewing documents recovered from the warehouse. "Multiple packs manipulated similarly to Elena's, debts manufactured, alliances undermined, all designed to create exactly the kind of instability that would allow him to expand his own influence once established kings and pack leaders were sufficiently weakened or discredited. And I was simply one piece of that larger plan," Elena said quietly, the scope of it settling heavily over her. "An important piece," Ronan said. "Important enough that he was willing to risk everything on the chance of eliminating me specifically. Whatever else he's planned, my death would have represented a significant step toward whatever larger ambitions he holds." Dorian's capture, combined with the documents recovered from his warehouse, provided enough information for Ronan's forces to finally locate Draven's remaining hideout, a fortified camp hidden deep within contested territory that had allowed him to evade capture for years. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive, Ronan's forces vastly outnumbering what remained of Draven's loyal followers after the earlier defeat in the clearing had already thinned his ranks considerably. Draven himself was captured attempting to flee, brought before Ronan in chains, within the same council chamber where Priscilla had once sat in defiant denial. "You should have stayed hidden," Ronan said, studying the man who had caused so much damage across so many lives. "And you should have died in that clearing," Draven replied, though his earlier confidence had faded considerably given his current circumstances. "Instead, here we are, and here you remain, still standing, still protected by whatever fortune keeps favoring you despite every effort I've made." "It wasn't fortune," Elena said, stepping forward. "It was people refusing to accept the fate you tried to force upon them. My father, however flawed his choices, ultimately helped uncover the truth about your manipulation. Priscilla, despite her own mistakes, confirmed information that helped identify Dorian. Every piece of your plan eventually turned against you because you underestimated the people you tried to use." Draven's expression tightened, though he offered no further response, understanding perhaps that nothing he said now would change the outcome awaiting him. "You'll face judgment for everything you've done," Ronan said. "Not just the attempt on my life, but every pack you've manipulated, every family you've destroyed, in pursuit of your own ambitions." Draven was led away shortly afterward, the weight of his defeat settling over the chamber as a collective sense of relief replaced the tension that had gripped the kingdom for weeks. Elena felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had remained tight since that first terrible night in the clearing, an ever-present anxiety about Draven's continued threat finally beginning to ease. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though changed considerably by everything that had transpired. Priscilla's exile proceeded as planned, her family working to rebuild their standing through more honest means going forward. Elena's father, informed of Draven's ultimate defeat and Dorian's manipulation fully exposed, began the slow process of rebuilding his pack's finances and reputation, a process Elena chose to support cautiously from a distance, their relationship still healing, but no longer defined solely by betrayal. "Are you ready?" Nora asked, adjusting the final details of Elena's dress, the fabric flowing elegantly as morning light streamed through the tall windows of her chambers. Elena studied her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her. Gone was the frightened girl who had stood bound at a wooden post, bait for a trap she never asked to be part of. In her place stood someone who had survived betrayal, uncovered conspiracy, confronted her own father with difficult truths, and helped bring down a threat that had endangered an entire kingdom. "I think I am," she said softly. The ceremony itself took place within the palace gardens, the same gardens where she and Ronan had first acknowledged the connection between them months earlier. Elena walked through gathered guests, faces now familiar rather than suspicious, many of whom had come to respect her not simply as someone rescued, but as someone who had actively contributed to protecting their kingdom from a danger that could have destroyed everything they valued. Ronan waited at the end of the path, dressed formally, his expression holding a warmth that made her breath catch despite everything they had already shared together. As she reached him, he took her hands gently, the same hands that had once been bound with rope, now free and steady. "From bait to queen," he said quietly, a soft smile playing at his lips. "Quite a journey. One I never would have survived without you," Elena replied. "And one I never would have understood without you," Ronan said. "You taught this kingdom, and me, that strength isn't always about who wins a fight. Sometimes it's about refusing to let circumstances define who you become." The ceremony proceeded beneath a clear sky, formalizing not just their mating bond but Elena's place within a kingdom that had once viewed her with suspicion, and now welcomed her as their queen. As vows were exchanged and the crowd erupted in celebration, Elena felt the last remaining shadows from that terrible night in the clearing finally fade, replaced entirely by the life she had built from the wreckage of betrayal. She had been sold as bait, discarded by her own father, bound and left for whatever fate the woods might bring her. Instead, she had found strength she never knew she possessed, love she never expected to experience, and a purpose far greater than anything she had imagined for herself in her old life. As Ronan drew her close beneath the golden afternoon light, surrounded by a kingdom that had become her own, Elena understood fully that every hardship she had endured had led her exactly where she was always meant to be, standing beside a king who had refused to let her go, in a life entirely her own to shape from this moment forward.